Christmas evening 1920. Monk Eastman, New York City's most notorious gangster to date, sits drinking with some cronies celebrating the holiday. At 47, a ripe old age for a man in his line of work, he has seen it all. His name is synonymous with gangsterism. Thanks to newspaper writers, most notably Herbert Asbury, he will be remembered as a knuckle-dragging dies dem dos kind of guy. Dies brass knucks hoit my fingers. Dem 5-pointers really had it coming. Dos cops is onto us. 2 decades earlier, he headed one of the largest gangs on the Lower East Side. He was old-school gang boss, actually taking part in his mob's battles and crimes. A trait that cost him much blood and many years in prison. It appears that he was born in 1873 to respectable parents and that he chose a life of crime. He either started late or was good at his craft because he wasn't arrested until 1898 when he was in his mid-20s. This resulted in a stay at the city penitentiary. 2 years later he was sent to the state prison at Elmira for attempted burglary. He started to gain notoriety at the dawn of the 20th century while working as a bouncer. Author Herbert Asbury tells us that, because of Monk's liberal and proficient use of the blackjack in club, ambulance drivers nicknamed the accident ward of Bellevue Hospital the Eastman Pavilion. Newspaper readers became aware of Eastman in 1901, when on April 14, he was gunned down on the Lower East Side. The motive for the shooting was never learned, but what is known is that the two brothers by the name of Donovan entered Silver Dollar Smith's saloon and approached Eastman and his pal Sam Frankel. One of the Donovans drew a gun and shot Frankel. Knowing he was next, Eastman hightailed it out the door. What happened next is best told by Monk himself. I was in Silver Dollar Smith's place at midnight when 2 brothers entered. One of them, known as Peggy Donovan, without warning, pulled his revolver and fired at me. He did not hit me. I ran out of the place, and they came after me hollering, "Stop thief." I ran to Orchard Street where 2 men grabbed me thinking I was a thief. Peggy Donovan reached me first. He pulled his revolver, pressed it against my stomach and fired into my abdomen. I fell to the sidewalk. Then the other brother ran up and shot me behind the ear as I lay on the sidewalk. When asked why he was targeted, Eastman said, "The only reason I can think of is the Donovans were overheard to say they intended to kill the gang which hung out in Silver Dollar's place as it was made up of stool pigeons." Frankel was saved by his pocket watch and released that afternoon. Eastman's wounds, however, were so serious that all assumed he would die, so when papers hit the streets the following day, it was erroneously reported that Monk had passed away. It is interesting to note that Eastman's statement of the shooting lacked the dies dem dos phraseology that came in the next few years in the tabloids. By the following year, Eastman was recognized as one of the top gang leaders in Manhattan. Though probably exaggerated, Asbury tells us that Monk could muster 1,200 troops if necessary. His position shouldn't be understated either. There was a group of young hellions who called themselves the Monk Eastman Juniors. Their chief purpose was to terrorize their neighborhood, gaining criminal experience and waiting for their chance to graduate to the real deal. 1902 was also the year the Eastmans started warring with other gangs. On October 4, Monk and a few dozen of his minions were hanging out on the second floor of Silver Dollar Smith's saloon when approximately 35 hoodlums believed to be members of the 5 Points gang rushed up the stairs and attacked with pistols and clubs. Monk fought with his boys as the room was destroyed. Some pistol fire attracted a couple of cops who ran for reinforcements. By the time they returned, the 5-pointers were gone. Monk and the boys were still there and so were arrested. The Eastmans were represented in court by an ex-assemblyman who claimed that the gang was innocent. It was the 5-pointers that did all the shooting. The gangsters walked. Though no one was killed outright, one of Monk's guys, Sam Levinson, died of a fractured skull due to his diving out the second-story window during the melee. Gang fights weren't good for business, so Tammany Hall politician Big Tom Foley called a peace conference the following week and made the 2 gangs end hostilities. A few months later, on December 22, Monk and 4 cronies boarded a Bowery streetcar. The conductor, who recognized Eastman, noticed the men trying to pick a man's pocket and called for them to stop. "I want you fellows to quit this," he hollered. "The cops may be afraid of you, but I am not." Monk approached the driver and punched him in the head. Then announced to the passengers, "Hereafter, he'll mind his own business." The car pulled into the next stop and the passengers poured off. The motorman joined the conductor and ordered the hoodlums off the car. Monk and the boys didn't care for the order and a fight broke out. News reports mention that Monk might have gotten the worst of it, as his face was pretty bashed up. During the fracas, one of Eastman's goons pulled a gun and fired off a few rounds. Hearing the shots, a cop ran up. Eastman and company told the cop that if he interfered with the fight, they would have him transferred. Undeterred, the officer came forward and the gangsters pounced, knocking him to the ground. Once he was down, they began kicking him. He was nearly unconscious when reinforcements arrived. 2 of the gang ran away while Monk and the remaining 2 were hauled off to jail. It's obvious that, in telling the cop that they would have him transferred, the thugs were well connected politically. They were safe in their arrogance. Monk was back on the streets in short order. It wasn't simply cops, conductors and motormen that the Eastmans battled. The public was fed a steady supply of gangland war news, much of which involved Monk and his boys and any of the gangs they were going at it with, like the Yakey Yakes, Five Pointers, Paul Kellys, or any other outfit on the Lower East Side. Eastman was pulled in again in April of '03, when saloon keeper and Bowery tough guy Big Dave Bernstein was shot. Monk and another guy named Flip Morris were brought to Bernstein's hospital bed, but the wounded man refused to say anything about the shooting. Monk was released. About a week later, a contingent of Eastman gang members stormed Bernstein's bar and shot it out with some of his followers. A few months later, Monk found himself in quite a mess by getting into trouble outside his realm of influence. In the summer of 1903, David Lamar, a wealthy stockbroker known as the Wolf of Wall Street, was having trouble with a former coachman named James McMahon, whom he had fired. McMahon had been vandalizing Lamar's summer home in Long Branch, New Jersey. Lamar hired Eastman to protect his house, and on July 3, the gang leader and 4 Confederates headed for New Jersey. They never made it out of Manhattan. As soon as they boarded the ferry to take them across the Hudson River, they were arrested as suspicious characters. Tammany Hall quickly sprung them and they made the trip the following day. Once they arrived, Monk decided he could handle the job with only one other guy. He chose Joe Brown and the other 3 returned to New York. For 5 days, Eastman and Brown guarded Lamar's house without incident. On July 9, bored with the assignment, the duo set out to find McMahon. Once located, they beat him to a pulp and stabbed him. When he got out of the hospital, McMahon accused Lamar of trying to have him killed. Eastman and Brown were identified as the attackers and arrested. Eastman contacted Lamar and let it be known that he had better take care of him. Monk and Brown sat in the Tombs for 2 weeks before being extradited to Freehold, New Jersey. After spending 11 days in jail there, Monk was bailed out and he returned to New York City. It's around this time that reporters took artistic license with Monk, helping to create the Dies, Dem, Dos persona later echoed by Herbert Asbury. At one point Monk spoke to the press in the courthouse. Here is how the New York Tribune related his statement regarding not knowing Lamar or McMahon. "Who is this man Lamar? I wouldn't know him if he came up and struck me in the face. As for McMahon, why, I never saw him until he identified me at headquarters," compared with how the more yellow tabloidish World relayed the statement. "Gwan, I never knew dis feller Lamar or Lamar, and if he come in here now and rapped me on de conch I wouldn't know him. I never seen dis fellow, McMahon, dey say I done, not until he identified me." Once he was back in New York, Eastman fell out of sight. Since this was a high-profile case, the media was curious as to what the gang leader was up to, and his disappearance was such that on September 16, the New York Herald asked the question, "Where's Monk?" The Herald, and all of New York, got their answer the next day when Eastman was involved in possibly the biggest gunfight the Lower East Side ever experienced. It was a primary day, and after long hours of election terrorism, Monk and his thugs returned to their usual terrain. The events leading up to the shootout began at 9 p.m. when Eastman gangsters George Lolly Myers, Isidore Bernstein, and Henry Lewis ran into rival gangster Anton Bernhauser in a saloon. Soon the guns were out, lights were doused, and Bernhauser was on his way to the hospital with his cheeks pierced by a bullet. Later, the trio crossed paths with another antagonist named Michael Donovan, and he too wound up at the hospital with a bullet in his mouth. Though he shook hands with Bernhauser on his way in. His wound was more serious and he died a short time later. In addition to the two shootings, the three Eastmans found time to rob a guy of about $40. Around 2 a.m. the following morning, members of the Paul Kelly gang confronted the Eastmans under the elevated trains at the intersection of Rivington and Allen Streets. There, approximately 25 gangsters shot it out until a large squad of police officers showed up and chased them from the battlefield. In the ensuing sweep, police raided Lolly Myers' apartment and found the trio that instigated the gunfight. Myers was suffering from 2 bullet wounds in the leg. Bernstein got nicked in the cheek and Lewis escaped unscathed. Also in the apartment, police found Monk himself. All 4 were arrested, but Monk was released for lack of evidence. Lolly Myers ended up being sent away for 14 years, not for either of the shootings, but for robbing the guy earlier that evening. When it was announced that Michael Donovan had died, it was assumed by the press that he was one of the Donovan brothers who shot Monk back in '01, but the family denied this. In mid-October, Monk was back in Freehold, New Jersey on trial for assaulting James McMahon. Word came that a contingent of Eastman gang members were headed to Freehold. Extra guards were placed on duty to thwart any trouble, but to the surprise of all, the gangsters were well behaved. They said that they were only there to give Eastman an ovation if he was found innocent. After 2 days, Eastman was found not guilty. He received his ovation and returned to New York City a free man. A few months later, on December 6, Monk was hitting the pipe in an opium den with a number of cohorts when the joint was raided. He and his pals were arrested, but his politician friends sent in a lawyer and all were sprung after a few days. The day after he was released, he and 7 companions attended the bicycle races at Madison Square Garden. Cops noticed them and assumed they were there to pick pockets. Soon they were all hustled into a black Mariah for a trip to the station. After a short time they were released. The fall of Monk Eastman began in the wee hours of February 2, 1904. Hanging out around the Times Square area, Monk and a pal noticed an intoxicated rich young man, and decided to roll him. The young man's father, however, used to his son's debauchery, hired a couple of Pinkerton detectives to follow him around and keep him out of trouble. When the hoodlums made their move on the inebriated dandy, the Pinkertons opened fire. Monk and his confederate whipped out their own irons and a running gunfight ensued. Hearing the shots, 3 cops came on the scene and after a short chase, collared Monk and his cohort. 2 days later, Monk was charged with first-degree assault. Another guy came forward and claimed that the gang leader had taken a couple of shots at him 2 weeks previously. Monk lamented to the press that the authorities were trying to get rid of him. He was released on bail but arrested again with 6 gang members on a 34th Street streetcar. Although they claimed to be going to the fights, police decided that they were there to rob theater patrons. On April 12, Eastman went on trial for first-degree assault for attacking the drunk rich guy. The gangster showed up to court looking his dapper best. Papers mentioned that he was better dressed than anyone on the jury. A large group of well-dressed followers also showed up. As he was leaving court on the first day, the wife of his jailed pal Lolly Myers gave him a kiss. The second day of the trial found Eastman on the stand defending himself. It was a mistake as he admitted to being a perjurer. At one point the prosecution asked, "Didn't you swear in Freehold that you never had been convicted of a crime?" Eastman responded yes. That was not true, the prosecution replied. No, it was not. Monk also told the jury that he wasn't trying to rob the young drunk man, but actually trying to help him. He thought the Pinkertons were bandits and was trying to protect him. The jury didn't believe him and after an hour's deliberation, Monk was brought back into the courtroom. He turned ghastly pale when he heard the verdict guilty pronounced. Sentenced to 10 years, Eastman was taken back to the Tombs where he remained for about a week. On April 23, he emerged from the prison smoking a cigar. Seeing the boys from the press, he said, "Well, I'm going now. This is the last you'll hear of Monk for a while." With that, he climbed into the back of the Black Maria and joined the other felons for the trip to Sing Sing. Though he was gone, Monk's name continued to appear regularly in the papers. Not for anything he did, but the men associated with him and his gang, real or imagined. The fact that Monk was a first-time prisoner in a state prison coupled with good behavior saw the gang leader paroled in June 1909. A few months later he was in the news again. Not for committing a crime, however. The gangster, now 36, was suffering from stomach pain and checked himself into the Harlem hospital. "I'm all in," he told the attendant. "I've got pains in me stomach, and I've been suffering hell for days." The hospital staff didn't know who he was, but were alarmed when they came across his countless scars during the exam. "When did you get those?" he was asked. "In the war," the gangster replied. "Are you a Spanish War veteran?" they asked. "Nah," Monk replied. "I picked them up in wars around New York City." The hospital called the police. A couple of detectives stopped in and informed them that their new patient was the infamous Monk Eastman. They operated on him for an undisclosed malady and he made a successful recovery. Eastman managed to keep his nose clean during his parole, checking in with the police on a regular basis. He supposedly worked on a farm for a while and then took a job in Albany, under a fictitious name. In the latter half of 1910, he was released from his parole and announced that he was moving out west. By out west, he meant the East Village in Manhattan, where he opened an opium den. This establishment was brought to the attention of New Yorkers in the spring of 1911 when a city magistrate charged the mayor with allowing crime to flourish. He stated that both city officials and the police were aware of Eastman's drug parlor but did nothing. They continued to do nothing for an entire year. By this time, Eastman had moved his operation to an apartment on East 13th Street and was serving up to 30 users a day, including himself. On May 1, 1912, he was arrested during a raid and placed in the Tombs. He pleaded guilty to manufacturing and smoking opium and was sentenced to 8 months on Blackwell's Island. After his stint in the pen, Eastman headed for Buffalo, New York, where he was arrested in the fall of 1914 with 2 other men. When searching his cohort's apartment, police found some stolen goods from a number of robberies. Nothing was found in Monk's possession, so they had to let him go. Monk was picked up again a week or so later, following 3 other robberies. Though they had nothing on him, they ordered him to leave town, which he didn't do. He was picked up again on a vagrancy charge and, when asked how he pled, he whipped out a large roll of bills to prove that he wasn't a bum. Despite his plea that he was only in town for medical reasons, he was ordered once again to leave the city. This time the police escorted him to the train station, bought him a one-way ticket back to New York City and watched him leave. Next, Monk ended up in Albany as part of a robbery ring. On May 17, 1915, the New York City Police received a call from the Albany PD telling them to be on the lookout for a 7-passenger sedan containing a chauffeur and only 2 passengers. They believed that the 2 passengers were robbers bringing loot to the city to be fenced. As the sedan entered the city, an officer pulled it over under the pretext of giving the driver a ticket. Before anyone inside knew what was happening, the car was surrounded. Opening the door, one of the officers saw a familiar face. "Well, if it isn't Monk Eastman," he said. Eastman simply smirked. Police found 2 suitcases in the car containing $1,000 worth of silver stolen from numerous Albany homes. Other than admitting his identity, Eastman refused to answer any questions. Telling the police, "Well, you have the silver. So go as far as you can, but don't expect any help from me." In addition to numerous pawn tickets made out to his alias, William Delaney, a search of his Albany abode turned up some burglar's tools and a gun. On July 1, he pleaded guilty to robbery and received a sentence just shy of 3 years. After serving a little over 2, he was released and returned to New York City. By this time, America was involved in the Great War in Europe, and within a few days of his return, Monk entered a Brooklyn recruitment center and enlisted under his usual alias, William Delaney. After some time, the Army discovered that Private Delaney was actually the notorious Monk Eastman. there was some talk as to whether he should be allowed to serve with his record. By this time, however, he had made a good impression on his fellow doughboys and his officers, so was allowed to stay. It was a good decision on Uncle Sam's part to keep Eastman in the ranks. By all accounts, he was an excellent soldier and served with bravery. Stories were told of his volunteering to stay at the front to act as a stretcher bearer after his outfit had been relieved and sent to the rear. After being wounded, he left the hospital to rejoin his unit. Another story had him crawling across no man's land with some grenades to knock out a German machine gun nest. Supposedly he had a knapsack shot off his back during the assault. When Eastman returned with the 106th Infantry in the spring of 1919, he received an honorable discharge, and his officers successfully petitioned Governor Al Smith to restore his citizenship, which had been stripped due to his imprisonments. Much ado was made of the fact that New York City's most famous gangster was now a reformed war hero. It was believed and hoped that he would make good with his second chance. Eastman himself may have even believed it. He made a statement and the press seemed to be on his side. Gone was the cartoonish Dees, Dem and Doe's character. There is nothing in crime, he told them, there is nothing in being a thug. A gang leader never gets anywhere. The pity of it is that there are a lot of young fools growing up who try to make a reputation by being slick. If they could only know in advance, as I know, how little there is in it beyond disgrace and privation, they'd quit now. They'd get jobs and stick to them. After a bit more lecturing, he ended with, the rest of my life is going to be spent honestly, at hard work, and not being a rotten outcast. A suspicious type would be excused for thinking that Monk's introspective statement may have been prepared for him in advance. Once the accolades subsided, the painful truth remained. Eastman was a lifelong criminal pushing 50. Perhaps there were a few jobs, but after a career in crime, Monk wasn't cut out for a 9-to-5. By the spring of 1920, he wasn't above stealing cars. In his book on Arnold Rothstein, author and newspaperman Donald Henderson Clark tells us that in May of that year, Eastman took part in the theft of vaudeville star Fanny Brice's Cadillac. After a phone call, the car was returned. Fast forward to that Christmas. Monk spends the evening drinking it up with some buddies in Brooklyn. Around midnight, they hire a sedan to take them into Manhattan. The car drops them at the Bluebird Cafe on 14th Street and 4th Avenue, and they descend down the stairs into the bar. One of Monk's drinking companions that evening is a crooked Prohibition agent named Jerry Bowen. Whether or not Monk is involved in bootlegging is unknown. Whispers of bootlegging, drug dealing and robbery will whirl around town in the coming days. To add fuel to the flames of intrigue, he has in the neighborhood of $140 on him. That's well over $2,000 in today's dollars. And he is wearing a well-made suit to boot. In his pockets are 2 pairs of gold-rimmed glasses. So, it does appear that Monk has something going on. Eastman and Bowen have a history of not always getting along. In the past they have gotten into an argument which resulted in Eastman drawing a gun and threatening to shoot Bowen. But this is a Christmas party, and for nearly 4 hours the group enjoys themselves as the piano player knocks out tune after tune. Monk is smitten by the female singer who seems to direct all her songs at the aging gangster. At 4 a.m., Monk and his companions are the only revelers left in the place. As they settle up the bill, Eastman wants to tip the entire staff, including the entertainment. His parsimonious friends disagree, especially Bowen, who only wants to tip the waiter. They argue for a while and it's decided only the waiter will receive a gratuity. It is not a good ending to the celebration, and now Monk has turned from a happy drunk to an angry drunk. After the tipping dispute, Bowen and the others are probably no longer in the best of moods either. The men leave the tavern and climb the steps to street level. When they reach the top, Eastman grabs Bowen from behind and calls him a rat. Remembering the near-death experience from before, Bowen draws a pistol and empties it at Eastman. The former gang leader throws up his hands in a futile attempt to protect himself as bullets plow into his heart, chest and abdomen. He drops to the gutter. As his cohorts flee, Bowen tosses his gun away and jumps on the running board of the nearest taxi and escapes. He'll eventually claim self-defense and only serve a few years. Passers-by pile the expiring Eastman into a cab for a ride to the hospital, but he dies on the way. It is Eastman, the war hero, that gets buried. He was laid out in his military uniform, and his fellow doughboys carried his casket through the streets of Brooklyn while at least 2,000 people looked on. Though newspapers hinted at Monk's possible return to crime despite his claims of going straight from the previous year, his former comrades in arms eulogized him in terms more befitting a war hero. Mr. Edward Eastman did more for America than any presidents or generals, one fellow soldier said. The public does not reward its heroes. Now they are calling Mr. Eastman a gangster instead of praising him as one of those who saved America, but we'll do right by this soldier and give him the funeral he deserves. At his final resting spot, Monk received the soldier's farewell of taps and a rifle salute. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing. If you would like to read about more New York City gangsters bumped off during Prohibition, you can check out these books. Links are in description. There's also a PayPal link if you would like to support the channel.